you probably recognize those as the first words of William Carlos Williams' elegant little poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. They came to mind to me today when I was thinking about our program. Like this little poem, our seemingly casual gathering here for these 2 days can be the foundation of something really important and real in the world. And after last night, I'm convinced that we got off to that kind of start. So to those of you who are joining us today, we're sorry you had to miss last night. The speakers began with a panel discussion about some of the key points from Dr. Cowan's chapter, The Spirit of Liberal Learning. For a physicist, that man writes like a poet. Dr. Derisiewicz gave us a big picture talk about culture, the tension inherent in culture in our lives, and then Dr. Ravitch gave us a talk she wrote particularly and specially for us, a survey of the history of liberal education in America. And what I found most helpful about Dr. Ravitch's talk was, in a grim kind of way, that in the nature of the tension of schooling itself, it all began when schooling began. It's not our problem, it's not original. Standardized testing and the tension between vocational and college prep, those things. This isn't just our difficulty, in other words, it's built into the challenge of education itself. Because education is about human relationships. And as Dr. Derisiewicz said last night about culture and life, with these things, one is always starting at the beginning, over and over and over again. And so it is with education. Just a few details before we begin our first panel. If you have a question that you would like to be considered in this afternoon's plenary session, there are cards out at the registration table with Aaron. Please write your question there by 2:05. We'll pick those up, and then we'll entertain those this afternoon. Also, do join us at the Institute for our Afterglow program this afternoon. We're going to continue the conversation with adult beverages, which we can't do here at a school facility, and some light refreshments. So it will be a good time, as always, at the Dallas Institute. And please notice on the inside of the back cover of the program, our first follow-up program on October 8th. We invite you to that. We'll be discussing that perennial tension that Dr. Ravitch introduced us to last night, the tension between the vocational and liberal educational modes. And we're going to use W.E.B. Du Bois's talented 10th essay and Booker T. Washington's essay on industrial education. That was their argument in the first decade of the 20th century, and it's still our argument today, so we'll be going back there. So today, before the panel this afternoon, we'll have 3 sets of brief panels, as you can see in your program, brief talks and then discussions. We're going to see different styles, we're going to see different topics, but everyone is aimed at illustrating or examining further the spirit of liberal learning. We asked our presenters not to use PowerPoints, and so some of them have some passages selected in the program that you may want to follow along with, and I'm sure they'll direct you to them. But if Dr. Donald Cowan is correct, that one of the chief purposes of education is the cultivation of language, we wanted to spend our time and focus today thinking about language and people and faces, not PowerPoints and graphic designs. And so this is why we have just out here in front of everyone these wonderful speakers speaking to us. Remember, we're not trying to figure liberal learning out today. We're just trying to come up with some new and fresh perspectives, have some new material, as I said last night, on what it can be. And so let's begin our program today.
Good morning. Good morning. Anyone who loves Melville as much as Dr. Andrew Delbanco appears to certainly deserves a place on stage in the Cowan Center program. Sir, 2 generations of the 3,000-page club salute you. Along with his distinguished career as a scholar, as an award-winning author, and as a nationally recognized social critic, Dr. Delbanco has been in the classroom for more than 30 years. We help students better understand how classics inform the way we live. With special gratitude for the passion, for the dedication that he brings to the study of great literature, we welcome Dr. Andy Delbanco to the podium.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I confess that some of you have already figured out what you have standing in front of you is sort of a proverbial character out of a Woody Allen movie, the New Yorker who becomes mildly hysterical anywhere west of the George Washington Bridge and anywhere where the streets are not numbered and organized in a grid. So I've been dealing with that, and I'm very grateful to the folks at the Dallas Institute for helping me through it. So, and how many of you were here last night? Oh, good. Oh, excellent. Okay, then I can make some allusions to what happened last night, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to inflict a formal lecture on you this morning. Figure at 9 on a Saturday morning might be merciful not to do that. But I do want to make some, I hope, somewhat organized remarks. But the first thing I'd like to say is listening to Bill Deresiewicz last night talking about this age-old conflict or contrast between the two cultures of science and the humanities put me in mind of an anecdote that I would like to share. Some people in this room will probably remember back in the 70s, I think it was 1978, when OPEC decided to push the price of oil up and reduce production. We had a lot of gas lines in this country, right? And the university where I was working at that time decided it wanted to save money, and it was in New England, wanted to save money in the wintertime by closing the library during the month-long Christmas recess. So those of us who worked in the humanities were quite upset because that was the time when we actually had time to go to the library and read the books, and people came from far away to read them too. And I remember once sitting at a lunch table with a distinguished professor of chemistry, and I was complaining, or what probably sounded to him like whining, or kvetching, to use a more formal term. And he said, you know, I don't get it about you people in the humanities with the library. Those of us in the sciences, we just throw away the old books. And that, for me, sort of crystallized the point that Bill was making last night. And I want to say, as he did, I don't say that with any shred of disrespect for the scientists who do extraordinary work and in many ways have helped us all to lead better lives. But it is a different way of thinking about the relationship between past and present. What is the point of spending your time with old ideas if we have, in fact, according to some people, superseded them and gone beyond them? It's my view that we haven't gone beyond them entirely, or maybe not even at all. I guess another way to put this would be that, as far as I can make out, when a scientist makes a truth claim, we talked yesterday about joy and about freedom. Another very important word in Don Cowan's essay is truth. When a scientist makes a truth claim, he or she subjects that claim to an experimental test. And the first thing that happens is that another scientist in another laboratory somewhere tries to replicate the results of that experiment. And if it's replicated, the truth claim stands. And if it can't be replicated, the truth claim starts to shake a little bit. In the humanities, I don't think we do that. I think when we make claims to truth, the only experiment to which we can subject them is the experiment of our own lives. And that makes the whole assessment regime that we've been talking about very tricky. How do you measure truth if at the end of the day it's really a matter of whether you live according to the truth? Now, I want to get away from the abstractions, which is why I brought a couple of passages with me. But before I get to those two, I want to read you very briefly something that made the point to me when I was teaching. And another thing I guess I wanted to say that didn't quite get said last night is that, to me, the best way to learn is to teach. I often have felt that I didn't really understand the texts that I claimed to have some expertise about, or that I was even writing about, until I started to teach them and to try to communicate their complexity to students. So some years ago, in the Great Books course that we have still at Columbia for our first-year students, I found myself teaching Homer's great war poem, the Iliad. I could only teach it in English translation because, unlike some of the other panelists whom you'll be hearing from later, I can't read it in Greek. But there comes a moment in that poem when Homer is describing how the Trojan soldiers have overrun the Greek defenses. And in the translation we were using, it goes like this: they streamed over in massed formation with Apollo in front, holding the tremendous aegis, and wrecked the bastions of the Achaeans, the Greeks, easily. And here's the goosebump moment. Here's the moment when I really sort of jumped, even as I was reading this with my students. As when a little boy piles sand by the seashore, when in his innocent play he makes sand towers to amuse him, and then, still playing with hands and feet, ruins them and wrecks them. So, you know, I'm sitting there in a classroom on the Upper West Side of Manhattan with these 17 and 18-year-old, mostly American but not entirely American young people, and we've just encountered a datum, a piece of data, showing us that little boys on the banks of the Aegean some 3,000 years ago did exactly the same thing that they do today on Hilton Head or at your favorite Gulf beach or wherever it may be. And that was a real, I mean, it seems perhaps banal and beyond obvious, but it raises the question about which people have very different and conflicting opinions, whether there is in fact such a thing as human nature, and whether human beings have changed all that much in the last 3,000 years, or whether the main changes have been technological, and thereby we have much greater power to do both the good things and the bad things that we do to one another. Okay, I didn't mean to deal with so many preliminaries. I brought two passages that I thought we would look at together for just a few minutes, because at the end of the day, you know, a lot of people that you'll be hearing from and have already heard from are in the business of defending liberal education. It's my sense that we can only get so far in doing that when we speak about its efficacy, what it can do, what it can't do. At the end of the day, it's really about experiencing it. And one of the problems I think that we're up against, whether it's convincing certain superintendents or state legislators or governors or even presidents that liberal education matters, is that it's very, very hard to convince someone of the value of a liberal education if that person has never had one. Mm-hmm. If it's not something that one has experienced, you can talk until you're blue in the face and you get a lot of blank stares in response. So I wanted not to model what it, in any sense, what a complete liberal education would mean, but just a little bit of sort of what I do and why I believe that working through complex and demanding literary texts with young people is a valuable enterprise, and what it might mean to do that. Now, I think that the title that I gave to this talk is Slow Reading, and it just popped into my head, so I sent it to Claudia, and she said, okay. But I guess what I wanted to suggest by that is that, you know, we live in a world that is completely filled with digital noise now, right? And finding time for contemplation, finding the opportunity to slow things down, especially for our students who are tweeting and texting 24/7, 365, is an increasingly challenging thing to do. There's a danger of my digressing into more anecdotes, but it comes to mind that in in 5th grade, I had a teacher who was taking us through a social studies textbook. And in that textbook, there were some predictions. Now, this was, I'm dating myself, this was in the very early 60s. And the cutting edge technology was, you know, like automatic transmission, the car, big, giant, super heavy color TVs that most people could not afford, washing machines that would turn themselves on and off without your telling them what to do. So we had this textbook, and it said, look, the technology of the future is going to be mind-boggling, and it's going to create a fundamental problem for the next generation. And that problem is going to be, what will we do with our leisure time? Now, how many people here, raise your hand if that's your biggest problem. Right. Is anybody? Okay. So I met one person actually who said that was a problem. He was a peculiar person. But, so, you know, the point is these gadgets that we all carry around with us, I'm certainly guilty of it, they were supposed to help us perform certain tasks more efficiently and open up the space for contemplation and self-understanding and better conversations with other people, but in fact, I think we probably would all agree that they've had exactly the opposite effect, that they steal time from us. So that's one reason that I believe that what I'm calling slow reading, which is really just a way of saying reading, because reading is, at least as I understand it, is a silent activity, not always, but mostly, and a solitary activity, although one might wish to share one's reading experiences with other people. So it cuts against the grain. So let's cut against the grain for just a few minutes and look at these two passages. Now, the first one is from the author who's already been mentioned as a favorite of mine. It comes from the book that Herman Melville wrote just before he wrote his most famous book, Moby Dick. It was published in 1850, and it records in part his experience serving on a United States naval military vessel. And he reports the experience, and it's not entirely clear whether he had this experience or someone else aboard the ship had it, of being called before the mast by an officer who accused him of failing to be at his station when he was supposed to be. And the punishment for this infraction was to be flogged. So he describes the response in the first person of this quasi-fictional character to the recognition that he's about to be publicly flogged by order of the captain. And let's just read it quickly. The captain stood on the weather side of the deck. Sideways, on an unobstructed line with him, was the opening of the lee gangway where the side ladders are suspended in port. Nothing but a slight bit of sinnet stuff served to rail in this opening, which was cut right down to the level of the captain's feet, showing the far sea beyond. I stood a little to windward of him, and though he was a large, powerful man, it was certain that a sudden rush against him along the slanting deck would infallibly pitch him head foremost into the ocean, though he who so rushed must needs go over with him. My blood seemed clotting in my veins. I felt icy cold at the tips of my fingers, and a dimness was before my eyes. But through that dimness, the boatswain's mate, scourge in hand, loomed like a giant, and Captain Claret and the blue sea, seen through the opening at the gangway, showed with an awful vividness. I cannot analyze my heart, though it then stood still within me. But the thing that swayed me to my purpose was not altogether the thought that Captain Claret was about to degrade me, and that I had taken an oath with my soul that he should not. No, I felt my man's manhood so bottomless within me that no word, no blow, no scourge of Captain Claret could cut me deep enough for that. I but swung to an instinct in me, the instinct diffused through all animated nature, the same that prompts even a worm to turn under the heel. Locking souls with him, I meant to drag Captain Claret from this earthly tribunal of his to that of Jehovah, and let him decide between us. No other way could I escape the scourge. I'm going to stop there and then read the rest of it in a moment. Just to say, you know, there are a lot of ways to come at this. One way is to read it historically. And we've been talking among ourselves, and I suspect you agree that one of the great deficiencies in our culture and for our students is that there's such a limited, flattened, maybe even erased sense of the past. So one thing to do is to try to situate this. This is 1850. What's going on in 1850? I might ask my students. Well, one thing that's going on is that this state right here, the state of Texas, just a very few years before that, had entered the Union, right, as a slave state. And the United States was engaged in a struggle with itself over how it was going to divvy up the vast territories that it had just seized from Mexico in the war with Mexico a few years before that. In short, slavery was relentlessly, unstoppably moving toward the center of America's consciousness and the political debate, despite all the efforts that had been made to keep it from that. So no one could write in 1850 about a flogging that's about to be inflicted for reasons that have nothing to do with justice without anyone reading it thinking about the problem of slavery and the fact that millions of people within the borders of the United States were subject to this kind of treatment every day. So this is a passage about slavery, even though the word is never mentioned. And then one might begin to talk with one's students about, well, why doesn't he mention it? Why is it oblique? And that leads us to a lot of possible answers. My answer would be that Melville actually understood the horror of slavery well enough to know that he couldn't write about it from the position of someone who actually experienced it. Only once in his career did he write directly about the problem of slavery. That would be a few years later in a great short novel called Benito Sereno. It was his judgment that it could only be written by a white writer. I'm not sure this is true or not, but this was his judgment with this kind of obliquity. But then I think if we're going to go deeper into the passage, lots of other issues come tumbling out of it, one of which Elizabeth writes about very powerfully in her wonderful book, Soldier's Heart, in a chapter called To Obey or Not to Obey. This is a young man who has taken the oath of loyalty to serve his country in the military. He's been ordered to stand there and to take punishment, even though he knows he hasn't committed the infraction of which he's been accused. So Melville is bringing to the surface a very profound problem that's particularly relevant to those who serve in the military. When can I assert my individual autonomy against the authority that I have sworn to uphold? But that also is a larger question for all of us who live in a democracy. Where do we draw the line between our defense of ourselves and our submission to the rules, whether we like them or not? And that's a problem that had particular manifestations in 1850, but it's not a problem that has gone away or that will ever go away. So it's another example of a piece of literature that I would think in hundreds of years from now will still be read by some people, at least with a sense that Melville is talking about their own circumstances. Another way to read this would be to pull it right into the present and say, okay, enough with the history. What does this make you think of now? So here's this young man who says, I'm going to take this guy down and I'm going to go down with him. And we have a term for that, or in the last 15 years or so. We'd call him a suicide bomber. That he is somebody who is so outraged, or he feels this outrage welling up within himself so powerfully, that he is prepared to destroy himself in the act of resisting what he thinks of as an unjust power. So I get this passage might even then take us close to into that dangerous territory of trying to understand that mentality, which is in so many ways so alien to us and so far from us. So I could go on, but I won't, and I just want to read the short following 3 sentences. Nature has not implanted any power in man that was not meant to be exercised at times, though too often our powers have been abused. The privilege, inborn and inalienable, note how he uses the word that all of his readers in 1850 would have recognized from the Declaration of Independence, inalienable rights, that every man has of dying himself and inflicting death upon another. This privilege was not given to us without a purpose. These are, and here's the summary sentence of the whole passage, these are the last resources of an insulted and unendurable existence. So what he's done here, which is a characteristic move for Melville, is to go quickly and suddenly from a particular situation, a psychological portrait, to a general principle. And a general principle that he claims applies to all human beings. That there comes a point where existence has become so unendurable that this kind of radical self-destructive and violent action is demanded of us by nature itself, which is a very radical proposition. So there's a lot going on in this passage, and I think, I'm trying not to overuse my time, I think one could spend many hours on it in a class, and I think one could do it in a class with 14-year-olds as well as with graduate students. Great literature yields itself to the most sophisticated kind of reading and also the most honest, sort of unself-conscious kind of readings that you would likely get from some of your younger students, and asks us to make a connection with our own experience. So just very quickly, a much shorter passage, more or less randomly chosen from another writer whom I greatly admire, about 100 years later, and this requires a little explanation of context. This is from a great novel called The Heart of the Matter, which is about a very decent, sort of lapsed Catholic English civil servant who is serving in an English colony in Northwest Africa during the Second World War. And he's there in this very alien place with his wife, and her spirit has been crushed by the loss of their child. They've lost a child a few years earlier, and his wife is desperately depressed and more or less unable to function, and very sad to be where she is. Wants to be somewhere more like home. So her husband, who's, as I say, basically a good man, extends himself in various ways to make it possible for her to go to South Africa, which is something a little closer in its days, in its colonized days, to what she's used to. And she's grateful, and she goes off. So he finds himself in this colony now by himself. And then one day, a young woman, more or less literally, washes up on shore from a shipwreck. And she's a widowed young woman, and at first his relationship to her is one of a caretaker and a nurse, and he helps her back to health, and then it begins to evolve into a romantic and passionately sexual relationship. So he's committed the sin of adultery, and he's wrestling with this, and he's filled with guilt, And one day a telegram arrives, and the telegram informs him that his wife has decided that she doesn't want to be away from him, and she's coming back. And this is how Graham Greene describes his encounter with the telegram. All Scobie's consciousness was on the telegram, on that nameless boat edging its way now up the African coastline from the south. God forgive me, he thought, when his mind lit for a moment on the possibility that it might never arrive. And I pause here and would remind students that this is a period of the German U-boats are prowling the seas and destroying every vessel, civilian or military, that they can in order to disrupt the Allied supply lines. And then Greene does the same thing that Melville does. He leaves behind the particular situation, the particular story of this one man who is struggling with his conflicted thoughts. And he says, in our hearts there is a ruthless dictator, ready to contemplate the misery of 1,000 strangers if it will ensure the happiness of the few we love. My reaction to that is, it's true, isn't it? And it's a sentence that demands a lot of us to think how much we're willing to sacrifice in order to save what's dear to us. Scobie has no answer to the question, and he ends in an act with the act of suicide at the end of the book, because, well, for all kinds of reasons, because he has been unable to reconcile his loyalty to his wife with his love for this young woman and the principles of what he understands his faith to demand of him. Anyway, the point is, students don't have to have any particular interest in mid-19th century American history, and they don't have to have any particular affinity to this 20th century writer, but these are works that I think can compel them and us to confront these questions about ourselves. What are we willing to do to live according to the principles that we profess to believe in? And that's, I think, something like the value of, one aspect of the value of liberal education as far as I can make out. I'm going to close with one other very short quotation that I stumbled upon years ago when I was in the library of the University of North Carolina looking for something quite unrelated. And I came upon the diary of a young student who had been at a place called Emory and Henry, a Methodist college in Northwest Virginia, also by coincidence in the year 1850. And he had come back to his dorm after attending a lecture by the college president. In those days, the job of the college president was to give the capstone course. And the capstone course was always a course in moral philosophy. It was meant to pull together everything that the student had learned in his, it was in those days always a his years of college. And the president was almost always a clergyman. So this wasn't really a lecture, it was a sermon. So this young man comes back to his room after hearing this sermon, which has evidently shaken him up, and I'm guessing made him ask some of the kinds of questions I've been raising about himself. And he writes in his diary a sentence that I've never seen improved upon as a definition of what we would hope a liberal education would make possible for our students. Oh, that the Lord would show me how to think and how to choose. How to think and how to choose. I can't do any better than that, and I would just say, he doesn't say what to think or what to choose. That's not our business as teachers, to tell our students what they should think, but to show them the obligation to think and the difficulty of making the hard choices, I think, is part of what we're about. Thank you very much.